Imagine this. You've just moved into a new home, and it's everything you've ever wanted. Spacious, quiet, tucked away from the noise of the city. A place to finally breathe, to escape the chaos of your past. The idea of starting over fills you with hope. But sometimes, hope can be a dangerous thing. What happens when you move into your dream house, only to discover it's not yours at all? This is the true story of the Carter family. They thought they were getting the perfect home, a fresh start, until they realized that this house had a history that didn't want them to stay, a history that would never let them leave. Daniel and Emily Carter were an ordinary couple. 2 kids, a dog, and the kind of life people dream of. At least that's what they thought. The stress of living in a bustling city had worn them down. Long hours at work, constant noise, and neighbors who never seemed to understand the meaning of quiet had taken their toll. So, when they found the old Victorian house on the outskirts of a small town in Ohio, they were ecstatic. It was beautiful. Tall windows, a wraparound porch, and enough space for their 2 kids, Olivia and Noah. The house was perfect. The agent was quick to reassure them when Daniel asked why it had been vacant for so long. "It's just an old house," the agent said with a smile, avoiding Daniel's eyes. "Nothing special. People just don't appreciate the old-fashioned charm anymore." The price was reasonable, almost too good to be true, but the house felt right. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. They moved in. The first few nights were peaceful. The house creaked in places, and the wind howled through the trees at night, but there was nothing unusual. Emily would stand in front of the windows and smile at how peaceful everything was. The view of the empty field beyond the house was calming. But then it started. At first, it was the whispers. Soft, almost inaudible voices that seemed to come from nowhere. The family tried to ignore it, writing it off as the house settling or the wind. But it wasn't just the wind. Daniel had heard it too. One night, while he was watching TV in the living room, he felt a strange, cold breeze blow past him, even though the windows were shut. Then he heard it, a soft whisper of his name. He froze. "Daniel!" It was faint, but it was there. He turned around, but the house was empty. He chalked it up to the wind, but something about it didn't feel right. The next night, Emily heard it too. She was lying in bed, the moonlight creeping in through the window, when she distinctly heard her name being whispered. It came from the hallway, but when she got up to check, the house was still empty. They began to question their decision. Was it just the house settling, or was something else happening? Then came the night they would never forget. It was around 3 a.m. when the family was abruptly woken up by the sound of a baby crying. The couple's hearts raced. They didn't have a baby. They hadn't even planned on having more children. But the sound was unmistakable. The cry echoed through the house, loud and desperate. Emily shot up from bed, her breath catching in her throat. She grabbed Daniel's arm. "Do you hear that? It's a baby," Daniel whispered. He hesitated for a moment. "Where's it coming from?" They rushed to the nursery, their feet pounding down the stairs. But when they opened the door to the room, they found nothing. The crib was empty. There was no baby. The room was completely still. The door creaked open, and the baby's cry stopped as suddenly as it had started. They stood in the doorway, staring at the empty room, and yet, the air felt heavy. The room felt cold. Over the next few days, strange things continued. The family started seeing things in the corners of their vision. Shadows, flickering at the edges of the room. At first, it was a trick of the light, or so they thought. But the shadows began to linger longer, stretching unnaturally across the floor. Daniel and Emily both saw it one night. As they stood at the bottom of the stairs, they saw a figure standing at the top. "Did you see that?" Emily gasped. Before Daniel could respond, the figure disappeared. He ran up the stairs, but no one was there. They felt it then, the oppressive feeling of being watched. Every corner of the house seemed to hold something, waiting, lurking. The tension grew, and the whispers became clearer. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices calling their names, and they were coming from inside the walls. But it wasn't just the sounds. It was what they saw. One evening, after dinner, Emily was cleaning the kitchen. She stood by the window, looking out at the empty field when she saw something in the reflection. A face. She turned sharply, but there was no one behind her. The house was empty, but the face in the window hadn't gone away. It remained, staring back at her with hollow eyes, expressionless, frozen in time. Emily stumbled backward, gasping. She turned to see Daniel in the other room, but when she looked back at the window, the face was gone. She could barely breathe. The air in the kitchen had become thick. It wasn't just her imagination. Something was wrong. The house was alive, and it was becoming more apparent by the day. That night, they decided to investigate the history of the house. Emily went to the local library the next morning, determined to find out why this house had such a strange pull on them. What she uncovered was far darker than they could have ever imagined. The house was originally owned by the Whitaker family, who had mysteriously disappeared over a century ago. The family had lived there for years, but one night, they vanished without a trace. The police had no leads. There were rumors, but nothing concrete. However, one thing stood out. The Whitakers had a daughter, Elise, who had died young in the house. Elise had died under strange circumstances. Her death was ruled an accident, but the townsfolk spoke in hushed whispers about the tragedy. They said Elise's death was the beginning of the house's curse. As Emily delved deeper into the house's history, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be calling her name. The house wasn't just haunted by the Whitaker family. It was alive with their spirits. The deeper they went, the more the house revealed its true nature. It wasn't just a home, it was a prison. The spirits of the Whitakers were trapped, unable to leave. But they weren't the only ones. The house had a way of binding the souls of anyone who stayed too long. The more Emily learned, the more they realized. The house wasn't just a place to live. It was a place to stay forever. One night, as the family slept, Emily woke up with the sensation that she wasn't alone. The room was cold, too cold, and she felt a heavy presence at the foot of her bed. She turned, and there, standing in the darkness, was a figure. It was Elise. Her pale face stared at Emily, expressionless. Then the child spoke. "You can't leave." Emily's heart stopped. "What do you want?" she gasped. But Elise didn't answer. She just stood there, staring. And then Emily heard it, the sound of footsteps. The house was coming to life. The whispers became shouts. The walls creaked, and the house groaned. They weren't alone. Not anymore. The family knew it was time to leave. But the house wouldn't let them go. The doors were locked. The windows were sealed. In a desperate attempt to break free, Daniel tried to force the door open. But it didn't budge. The house had sealed them inside. It was keeping them. As Daniel struggled to force the door open, Emily backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. The house was alive now. It wasn't just a collection of walls and rooms anymore. It was something else entirely. It was a sentient entity, a thing that fed on fear, trapped its victims, and wouldn't let them go. It was as if the house had awakened, and now it was closing in on them. "Daniel, we have to go," Emily screamed, but her voice barely carried over the growing noise of the house. Creaking, groaning, the sound of something heavy moving in the walls. The air felt suffocating. They were surrounded, trapped. Suddenly, Noah screamed from upstairs. The sound was sharp, desperate, like he was in pain. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Mom! Dad!" Noah's voice rang out from the top of the stairs. "It's coming!" Before Daniel could react, the stairs creaked beneath their feet as something, or someone, began to descend. It wasn't Noah. It wasn't anyone from their family. Emily's eyes widened in horror as the figure materialized at the top of the stairs. It was a girl no older than Noah, wearing a tattered nightgown. Her pale face stared at them with hollow eyes, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. "Get away from her!" Emily shouted, instinctively pushing Daniel behind her. But the girl didn't move. She stood still at the top of the stairs, her eyes locked on them. The air grew colder still, and the house seemed to hum with energy. The walls were shaking now, the ceiling creaking as though the house itself were groaning in pain. "It's too late to leave," the girl's voice echoed, but it wasn't just her voice. It was many voices, layered over one another, blending together into a chilling chorus. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the very floor beneath their feet. Emily staggered back, shaking her head. "No, we can't stay here. We have to get out now." But the door wouldn't open. It was sealed shut, the windows trapped. Every time they tried to break them, the glass would melt back together, as though the house were alive, unwilling to let them leave. They were stuck. The walls around them began to throb as if the house was breathing. The floor shifted beneath their feet, and the air smelled damp, musty, like something long forgotten. Emily felt the weight of the house press against her chest, as if it were trying to suffocate them. "Emily, look out!" Daniel shouted, pulling her away just as the figure of the girl lunged toward them. The air shimmered for a moment, and the girl's form twisted, her body contorting in unnatural ways, her eyes black as coal. But then, as quickly as she had lunged, she stopped. Her mouth opened wide, a twisted grin forming on her face, as though the house itself were mocking them. "You will never leave," the voice repeated, over and over, until it felt like it was reverberating inside their skulls. The sound of scratching came from the walls, long, jagged nails digging into the wooden beams, leaving marks where the paint had once been. It wasn't just the girl anymore. The spirits were rising. "Emily, Daniel." Olivia's voice echoed softly in the distance. It was coming from the other end of the house, the bedroom at the far side of the hallway. Emily's heart sank. Olivia was calling them. "Olivia!" Emily cried, but the house only seemed to hum louder, drowning out her voice. They ran toward Olivia's room, but as they neared the door, a cold gust of air slammed into them. The door was closed, but the wind from the other side began to blow against it, rattling the wood. "It's trying to keep us out," Daniel murmured, his voice tight with fear. They tried to open the door, but it was as if something was holding it shut from the inside. Emily pushed against the door with all her might, but it didn't budge. And then they heard it, a voice, soft and cold, rising from within. "She's mine." The voice was low, barely a whisper, but it echoed inside their heads, pulling at their hearts, making them dizzy with fear. Without thinking, Emily slammed her shoulder against the door. The sound of splintering would echoed as the door cracked open. But what they saw on the other side was nothing like they expected. It wasn't Olivia. It was the Whitaker family, standing in the middle of the room, frozen, their eyes wide open and staring blankly into nothing. Their faces were pale, lifeless, like they had been preserved in time, trapped within the house, forever. The spirits of the Whitakers had never left. They were as much a part of the house as the walls themselves. And now they were coming for the Carters. Emily backed away slowly, pulling Daniel by the arm. Her breath was shallow, her body trembling as she tried to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around her. The house wasn't just a place. It was a prison, and now it wanted them to be a part of its collection. "Get out of the way!" Daniel screamed, pushing toward the center of the room. He grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at the air, as though it would shatter the invisible force that held them in place. The spirits didn't move. They didn't need to. The house had already made its decision. It was going to claim them. Suddenly, the floor beneath them gave way. A loud crack echoed as the wood splintered, and the family fell, straight down into the basement. Emily hit the ground hard, her body aching from the fall. She struggled to catch her breath. Around her, the spirits of the Whitaker family began to close in, their faces growing twisted with rage and sorrow. They circled her and Daniel, whispering words they could barely understand. It was as though they were caught in a time loop. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape. The house was alive, and the spirits had been waiting for them. And then the house spoke. The voice was deep and resonant, reverberating through the walls of the basement. "You are mine now. You cannot leave." The Carter family was never seen again. The house still stands, abandoned, waiting for the next unsuspecting family to move in. And every night, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint sounds of whispers in the walls, the soft cries of children lost to the house. And if you're not careful, if you're too eager to claim the perfect home, you might become part of its collection too. What would you do if you found yourself in a house like this? Would you stay, or would you run before it was too late? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this terrifying tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another bone-chilling story. Stay tuned, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying things aren't what you see, but what you can't.